Okay, good morning, everybody. We're going to get started here in just a second. We are figuring out several months into pandemic, and we're still figuring out some technical things. Um, can everyone hear me? I've got Alex in. Alex, can you hear me? All right, let's give me 1 second here, everybody. So, Alex, I think I've got video and everything for you. I just don't have audio. And thank you to everybody for letting me know you can hear me. I recognize it's a one-way webinar today, so that was a tough question that may be answered, but I appreciate you guys throwing it into the question box. Which brings me, while Alex is figuring out his audio real quick here, today, if you have any questions, we're happy to entertain them. Go ahead and throw them into that question box, and we'll go ahead and ask them as they come. We appreciate everybody joining us this morning. We are excited to talk about continuous cybersecurity.
Thank you, Karen.
Oh,
are you able to hear me?
Yes.
There we go. Hey, everyone, forgive me for the delay there. There was a little pop-up I was missing behind my my window. So
Well, and I feel like sometimes it's funny. We use this we use this platform a lot, but even I'll sign in and all of a sudden, like just now, I had my microphone was set correctly, but my speakers were set to something completely different. So we're glad that that we got it figured out here, and I will turn it over to you.
awesome. Now, Karen, would you just confirm that you can see my my screen? You shouldn't see any of my notes or anything. Just my
Nope, just the
entry slide.
presentation.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you everyone for the opportunity to present today. It definitely means a lot, and we're excited about the chance to do it. So because I couldn't hear Karen, I'm not sure exactly if she shared who I am. My name's Alex. I've been here at CyberForce Q for a long time now, roughly about a decade. And I've been responsible for the Q-Frame program over the last several years. If you're familiar with Q-Frame and what it's all about, you'll know that cybersecurity measurement, what we're talking about today, is just a huge piece of the puzzle. So it's something that I've spent a lot of time contemplating and working on over the last several years. My goal today, I'm here to share some of those learnings with you, some of my perspectives, and hopefully that'll spark some ideas for you that you might be able to utilize yourself. Of course, we'd love to collaborate directly with you on the Q-Frame, but if you're going to hear me share some of these things today, what I'm really hoping is that as we focus on these measurement concepts, that I know that they work. Hopefully you can find some things to take away. So with all that said, let's jump right in here. Since we're going to be focused on measurement, I wanted to lay out just a couple of core questions and put them on the table, and then we can address each of them together here. So the first is a question of why. In other words, why spend all of this effort and time and discipline working on cybersecurity measurement in the first place? The second question is, what makes this so difficult? We know that measurement is a complex topic. There are lots of different opinions out there, lots of different approaches. And in general, I would say that most organizations struggle at least a little bit here. So I'll share my thoughts on those questions and, in my opinion, why that is. And then finally, I'll share some of our learnings surrounding this concept of cybersecurity measurement. I'll tell you why it's been a game changer for us here at CyberForce Q. And that's really the whole point of the presentation, and that's what we're working towards. So just like I mentioned a moment ago, that's sort of our goal today, to encourage all of you who are participating to try to find at least one practical thing or idea or something that you can use to improve your cybersecurity program through improved measurement. All right, let's take a moment here to contemplate that very first question in the list, which was, why is cybersecurity measurement so important in the first place? To me, there's one overarching reason to cite, and it has to do with this idea of proactive versus reactive cybersecurity. As you can see on the slide, I'm going to give you a little bit of color about what I'm talking about there. So when you think of a reactive cybersecurity program, think of a company that's sort of always chasing solutions to their last failure. This is sort of the environment where we'll see perhaps a security incident or a breach or something like that. And then everything that happens after will be sort of a mad scramble to address that point of exposure. There will often be some expensive technology quickly deployed, and then the whole cycle will repeat the next time that there's an issue with something else. And then the end result in that sort of environment is that it sort of snowballs into a situation that's not really probably going to be that great from a security culture perspective, or even from cybersecurity in the first place, just because it's so reactive. In contrast, I'll also paint a picture of a more proactive approach. So here, imagine an organization that's more committed to a cybersecurity plan so that even when they experience an incident or some kind of problem, they'll address it, of course, but ultimately stay committed to that strategy without feeling the need to reinvent everything in response to the incident. So that might require much stronger confidence in the plan. But if we can achieve that, these tend to be the higher performing organizations with better security cultures and ultimately stronger performance. So now that I've sort of contrasted those two sorts of cultures, I'll share the two things that I think make a big difference between the two. The first is leadership buy-in to the security program, and the second is the presence of a well thought out strategic plan. What do those two things have in common? To me, one of the core things is measurement. Strong measurement helps us create the best possible action plans because we know that those actions will make the most meaningful improvement. It also helps us convey the nuances of cybersecurity to leadership in a way that's less ambiguous and probably easier to support. I know that was sort of a roundabout way of getting to the point, but this is why cybersecurity measurement is so important to me, and it's why it's so important to many others from my own experience. Of course, there are other benefits that come from strong measurement. I've got one right at the bottom of the slide there, and it's this idea that if we have strong measurement, we can often reduce the waste of time, money, or any other resource by helping ensure that we're focused on the most meaningful things at any one point in time. There's a whole lot more we could actually talk about here, but I'm going to assume that most of us see at least some value here in this concept of measuring our cybersecurity progress and then doing so to the best of our ability. All right, so the next thing I want to center around is that second question, which is, why is cybersecurity measurement so hard? There are tons of different reasons. One of them is this idea that good cybersecurity usually means that bad things happen less, and that's just not a straightforward thing to track directly, especially because of the wild variations and probabilities of bad things happening. Like I've got on the screen there, we can't just look at a good historical track record and just know that cybersecurity is in good shape. And there's lots of organizations with glaring weaknesses, not the greatest cybersecurity stature, and they just haven't been exposed yet. So that in itself is not a great measure. Then we also have the fact that there's a lot of inconsistency in how different organizations choose to measure their progress. And not just that, but even in the terminology that's used for different terms of measurement. Many of these options aren't great on their own. They at least all have some cons. And most of them tend to lend themselves to measurement at very specific points in time with long periods in between. Cybersecurity moves at a very fast pace. Most of us on the call probably understand that. So basically, things can get stale fast. I'll share a little bit more about that idea here on this slide, and I'll distinguish between what I call a snapshot in time style of measurement and then continuous measurement. So these aren't well-known terms or anything. These are terms that I use, but I'm going to be using them in the presentation today to convey some ideas. So I wanted to explain what they mean and what I'm referring to. When I refer to snapshot and time measures, I'm talking about assessment reforms that don't get refreshed very often. So this might be something that happens annually or quarterly, and in most cases will require a lot of effort to actually conduct. So normally we won't see much automation here either. So you can think heavier lifts that happen less frequently, different types of assessments and so on. We'll get into those specifics in a moment. The overarching challenge with snapshot and time work is that it loses relevance so quickly. It just doesn't pair well with the fact that these measures usually take a lot of time and energy to conduct. And with that time decay I just mentioned, it's just not usually a great situation. So if you're not quite tracking with me yet, bear with me. I'll go over a few specific examples in a moment. In contrast, that second big bullet, continuous measurement, is more about looking for ways to measure cybersecurity that we can execute at a more frequent interval, perhaps as frequently as daily. So here, we're going to want to lean on automation as much as we can to reduce the maintenance effort. When we do this, that information time decay becomes much less impactful because we have more frequent points of measurement. So we're still technically looking at specific points in time, but because of that shortened cadence, we can have more confidence in the output over the long run at any given point in time. So I just wanted to share that perspective before we get any further so that you can be thinking about these concepts over the next few minutes. All right, so let's touch on several of these different types of measurement. I want to start off with gap assessments. So this might be a self-assessment. It might be something that you have someone assist with. But in either case, it's about assessing your organization against a set of external standards or recommendations or some sort of regulatory driver. So this could be the NIST CSF, the CIS controls, or any number of other sources out there. These might be technical, they might be regulatory, it really does vary, but the idea is to conduct an assessment against the standards that you've picked. So the benefit of this approach when it comes to security is what I would call extreme efficiency. These can be conducted very quickly, and it might be helpful to engage outside help, but it's not an absolute necessity. You can probably do these yourself. So one of the nice things here is that you can quickly see the large gaps. So it doesn't necessarily take long to be able to come up with meaningful actions that you can take to improve. You can recognize the gaps and then immediately prioritize them. Now, the downside or the con for gap assessments is that they're a really blunt instrument. They create a false sense of security. If we think that we're doing well in any one area, but we're actually not, we may not recognize it. And then they also don't account for risk. And that's because if we're focused on gaps, we might end up with a sort of a misled takeaway, just because every organization is different. And if we're looking at a set of recommendations to rely on gaps, we also have to look at it through a lens of risk to truly understand. So that's a topic for another day, but we can't just assume that all gaps against the standard are equally meaningful. So the lack of risk consideration is a con. I'd say that this style of measurement does have an important role. We actually use these within QFrame for a very specific purpose, but they're just not the strongest form of cybersecurity measurement out there. Next, let's touch on external audits. So what I'm describing here is typically any situation where you're going to have an outsider coming in, maybe annually or at some other interval, and doing a really detailed, deep assessment of your cybersecurity. They might use the same standards that you rely on for a gap assessment, but most of the time these are going to be going deeper. They're going to be more time consuming in nature. So that external perspective can be super meaningful here. And I've got that as a pro, but there's also a pretty big disadvantage. And that's just that these are expensive. They can take a really long time to complete. And then they start to go stale the day after they're completed. Just like every other form of measurement, but when we're dealing with something so expensive and time intensive to conduct, that makes it more of a disadvantage with this approach. So that time decay adds up to one of the cons here. Now let's move on to risk assessments. So to avoid any confusion on the term, because sometimes you'll see different ways of describing this, what I'm talking about here is the more traditional asset-oriented or perhaps system-oriented approach to where we're doing a nuanced calculation of risk for a specific asset or system. So this might consider specific threat actors, likelihood of exploitations, vulnerabilities and compensating controls, impact, and all of those other sorts of considerations that we can feed into what would ultimately be a risk calculation. So this is a much more nuanced way to measure cybersecurity than, say, a gap assessment. The downside is it takes a lot more effort to run these assessments on a regular basis, and they're typically going to be focused more on your higher risk systems and skewed towards technical controls. And that's all well and good. These have an important role. This just isn't the most well-rounded method of measurement when it comes to cybersecurity as a whole. So risk assessments often fit more of a supplemental role than anything else in terms of cybersecurity program measurement. Next up, penetration testing. I don't know about you, I view penetration testing as a great way to validate that a cybersecurity program is actually as effective as we think it is in the real world. So in other words, this is a really great way to take a program that we think is high performing and then put that to the test. These pen testing results can also be a really great way to bring attention to perhaps matters that require resource. I can tell you that that penetration testing results are usually successful in their mission. So if you're looking to captivate the attention of leadership or some other stakeholders that you might want to get their attention, pen testing results can be a great way to do that. For the downside, I'll just mention that these tend to be very expensive as well and account for a pretty limited perspective. So what I mean by that is that most of the time you'll get some really great detailed information about a couple of important vulnerabilities and points of exposure, perhaps even the most significant, but you really can't expect a penetration test to give you a well-rounded oversight into your overall program standing, because pen testing tends to dive into specific key vulnerabilities. Let's move on to vulnerability scanning. So for the first time, I think it's about time to say that we can move into continuous measurement territory here. Scanning can be automated to run against systems on a regular basis, so we can start to get a more timely perspective and consistently timely perspective than we might be able to from some other measurement methods. So for the downside here, I've got the fact that vulnerability scanning is pretty focused on technical controls only, technical systems. So very useful, but we're not going to be able to measure the entire program this way. Even so, there's still a strong contrast with something like pen testing, because the scanning can be configured to report on a much wider range of the environment and vulnerabilities than perhaps a pure form pen test might. And that's of course why penetration testers often include vulnerability scanning reporting as part of their work output. All right, so here we are. We've arrived at metrics and KPIs. And this is the one I've been driving at, because metrics and KPIs really lend themselves to continuous measurement. I'll explain why that's actually important in a minute, and I'll also share some examples of the sorts of metrics I'm referring to here and why I've got maturity of measurement on the screen. So before we get to that, I'd personally say that if I could pick one approach on this list that I thought was the most important, I'd probably pick this. But of course, thankfully, that's not a constraint that we're actually forced into, so we can have the benefit of utilizing metrics to supplement all the other approaches on this list. And in the real world, that's what I believe is really necessary. Most great cyber programs tend to rely on all of these different forms of measurement, or at least 5 out of the 6, and it's really necessary to have a balanced program. Those of you who have worked with myself or CyberForce Q in the past know that there's 3 ways that we like to categorize these metrics and KPIs. And each of the 3 ways builds upon the last. So allow me to explain each, and then I'll give you an example. So first up, first stage of maturity, we have metrics of validation. And the way that I like to look at these is these are metrics that help us basically prove that we're doing the things that we think we're doing well. I find these to be helpful for building on something like a gap assessment, perhaps as the next step in maturity. And like I said earlier, the gap assessments don't always expose the areas where we're overconfident. Metrics of validation can. So my example for this one is my favorite example. You've probably heard it from me before if we've talked about metrics one-on-one, but it's a really great example. So I'll use security awareness training. Let's say we think we're doing a great job. We want to supplement our base level of measurement with a metric of validation. So we'd probably look to implement a metric to report upon the percentage of our workforce that has successfully passed the training test or taken the training within the last 6 months or maybe the last year. So as you can see, we're not getting too complicated with it yet. We're just adding a layer of validation to confirm that our team is actually being subjected to the training. If there's a surprise in this number, it's a great place to find out. Maybe we think everyone's taking the training, and then we generate this metric, and it turns out that only half the team is taking the training. So this is the sort of metric that can help us validate. Next up is metrics of effectiveness. So these are a more advanced style of metric, and they look to answer the question of, is the security control actually working? Did you catch the distinction? So less concern about if we've implemented the control, but much more focus on its actual benefit. So to use the same example, we'd probably rely on something like a phishing campaign click rate to speak to the effectiveness of security awareness training. If the training is working, we should see that reflected in the phishing campaign results, because team members will be learning about phishing, and they'll learn not to click those links. So that's an example of how we could measure effectiveness of security awareness training. Let's take the last step up to metrics of efficiency. So here we can look at our click rate, or the percentage of the team that took the training, and then contrast those results with the actual resource that was necessary to achieve that outcome that we got. So in other words, we might think about things like the cost of the training platform, or the hours that went into setting it up or running the phishing campaign, and really anything else that adds into the cost of that observed outcome. We can compare from one technology to the next, one organization to the next, and we can really start to have a meaningful conversation about resources and whether we're having a meaningful impact on cybersecurity. So if you can't tell already, I'm big on implementing control-aligned cybersecurity metrics and then using those metrics as the foundation of cybersecurity decision-making. So let's touch on the Cadence again. One of the great things about incorporating operational metrics across the board is that they can help you escape that paradigm that comes with snapshot and time measures. So to put it simply, you don't necessarily need to meet with your gap assessment team or conduct a round of auditing to implement an automated metric that helps validate that a control is in place, that it's working effectively, and that it's serving as an efficient use of resource. Once you've reached this level of maturity, you'll find that other forms of measurement might become less critical, or at least shift forms to become more useful in your more mature state. So we can recalibrate the action plan more effectively, more frequently. And then to give an example, let's say that you conduct a gap assessment, and then over the course of time, implement some of these metrics of validation to help confirm that the things that we're focusing on are as we believe them to be. Once you've matured to that level, running through that subjective assessment again just isn't so critical anymore. Maybe the next time around, you can focus on the specific areas that you don't have solid metrics in place for. This style of measurement, it's not without challenge. Some controls are those that lend themselves to measurement really well. Other ones aren't. So for example, if we're talking like something like the NIST CSF's business environment section and how business mission relates to cybersecurity, that wouldn't be first on my list to tackle with continuous metrics, but that's okay. We don't need to take this approach everywhere. We can really use it in the areas that we know it will be valuable and provide return. There's also some logistical challenges with these metrics. If we want to work towards continuous measurement, we need to work to automate. That's really the only way to do it well. And I can tell you our approach here. We have a cybersecurity measurement application. We've added two things, a metrics library and an API for technologies to rate to. So basically, we're able to configure our most important technologies to source operational metrics into that app and then inform the scoring as frequently as daily. Of course, that's sort of the ideal scenario, but if you're looking to start simpler, you can focus on automating perhaps in other ways, even if it takes a bit more work to convert the metrics into your own cybersecurity measurement reports, whatever those might look like. All right, so now that we've touched on some of the benefits of continuous measurement, I wanted to just share a few points and things to consider if you're looking to improve your measurement in your organization. So first, I just want to reemphasize that it takes a certain level of maturity to get to a place where it makes sense to implement and prioritize these metrics, especially for effectiveness and efficiency. If you've just started off, maybe you've just done a gap assessment and you've got the low-hanging fruit in front of you, maybe tackle that first and then work towards this over the long run. Another thing to consider is control mapping, which is sort of a necessary step if you want to actually feed these into your overarching security program, which is probably going to be aligned to a control source like the NIST CSF or something similar. You can get started on these metrics without having this yet, but if you want to do it at scale and at the macro level, you'll want to make sure that you have a way to map into that control framework. And then one final point to reiterate is that automation is your friend here. It's really difficult to jump into this territory without having at least some ability to automate. I'm not here to say it can't be done, but it will certainly require a lot of discipline to rely on more manual metrics effort. So all of these things are things that CyberForce Q and QFrame can help you with. So if you look at these and you don't see a great path forward on your own, we're always up to talk, share ideas, and then even give you some more insight about our own approach and ideas for addressing these questions. All right, so that's the material for today. Big thank you for joining and taking the time to be here. I hope this was able to spark some ideas for you and some things that you might be able to do to enhance your program with metrics, especially those that can be reliant on that frequent continuous measurement. I know that we have a text box here for questions, so if you have any questions or comments about anything I shared, feel free to drop a comment in, and if not, thanks again for joining.
Thank you, Alex. And yeah, if anyone has any questions, I've got the question box open, ready to moderate that and send them over. Okay, I'm gonna say, one of the things that I think is really interesting about some of the things you covered today, is just there's so many components, I think, to having a strong cybersecurity program, and a lot of this, it feels like foundational. A good place to start and kind of get an idea of what's going on and what you need to do. And I think that's an important thing too, where even for folks who have something established versus maybe something less established, just a good place to start if you're in either of those situations, to get that up-to-date information so that you can move forward.
Oh, absolutely, Karen. I mean, for me, it even looking at this, I think it might even feel overwhelming at times. So I would just encourage anybody who's sort of just taking this in. It's usually just about that next step. What's the next best thing you can do to improve your program's measurement or maybe your ability to create plans? And maybe that's not diving into metrics of effectiveness and efficiency, but maybe it's just finding a couple things that you can find metrics of validation for. Just that very first step, get a little better at that, get a little better, every month, and then it'll add up quickly.
Absolutely. Okay. I don't see any questions, but we will be able to post this. We'll post this webinar to our YouTube and get that out there. So if you missed it or you have someone you'd like to share it with, we certainly hope you do that. As like I said, I think this is a really interesting thing where it is applicable to not only people starting out, but also people who have been doing this for a long time. Just a good check-in where it is more often than just that year. Maybe that once a year lost in time. One of the things I think I've learned since working here is technology, and I you kind of know this is sort of, you get the latest model and it's out of date, and I think a lot of times the data works the same way. You get that snapshot and it's like, well, it's in your hands and it's already old. So definitely an interesting idea of sort of that continuous process, and being able to inform yourself with that continuous data. So we'll make sure we get that out to everybody, but we appreciate everyone taking the time this morning to join us. And thank you, Alex, for that great presentation. And we'll give some time back today, and everybody enjoy the rest of your day and the rest of your week.
Thanks all.